With all the chaos Vladimir Putin's juggling these days, it's a wonder he's still holding it together, or at least pretending to. From a so-called special military operation in Ukraine that's turning into an endless nightmare, to young Russians fleeing the country in droves, and a crumbling tech industry he just can't seem to fix, Putin's got his hands full. And if you think that's bad, well, it gets worse. Because for Russia, there's a ticking time bomb that even Putin's iron grip can't defuse. A population crisis that's shrinking faster than he can mobilize new conscripts. That's right, behind all the tough talk and big parades, Russia's future is looking a lot smaller. Putin might dream of rebuilding the glory days of the Soviet Union, but the reality? Russia's set to lose up to 15 million people by 2046. Forget being a world superpower. If things keep going this way, Russia could drop from the top 10 most populous nations to somewhere way down the list. So what's Putin going to do about it? Can he really talk his way out of this one? Let's just say things aren't looking good for Russia's strongman. While he scrambles for answers, the war in Ukraine continues to chew through Russia's population at an alarming rate. Right now, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine stands as one of the deadliest of the 21st century, especially given how long it's dragged on. According to the BBC, Russian sources have confirmed at least 70,000 deaths, but the real number is almost certainly much higher, since Russia's not exactly enthusiastic about sharing bad news. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, although known to exaggerate a bit, estimates that Russia has suffered over 670,000 casualties, including those 2 injured, to return to battle. Let's consider the second number for a moment. Over 670,000 dead or severely injured, as opposed to a minimum of 70,000 dead, means that there are over 500,000 people who are unable to serve in the military and yet need to rejoin civilian society. It's highly unlikely that all of them will be able to immediately get back to work, and we can assume that some of the injuries will be severe enough to remove them entirely from the traditional workforce that seems to be diminishing by the month. Additionally, Russia has been ramping up its conscription and military contracting efforts. By some estimates, it's processing roughly 300,000 new conscripts each year, plus an additional 200,000 contract soldiers. For mandatory conscripts, military service lasts for 1 year, at least on paper, pulling these conscripts out of the workforce for that period. For contract soldiers, the situation is slightly more complicated. When the special military operation changed to a war of attrition, Russia changed its policy on military contracts. Specifically, volunteers and prisoners could now sign short contracts for just a few months or a year, compared to the traditional 2-year contract that the military gave out before the war. Additionally, military contracts became much more lucrative, offering soldiers as much as 3 to 4 times the national average salary. That's meant that young men could be more easily lured into the army, thereby removing them from the available workforce for the industrial, tech, and service sectors, all of which are struggling to fill their rosters already. And the problem is only going to get worse, according to some analysts. According to the available estimates, September 2024 was the deadliest month for Russia yet, and the 5th consecutive month when the daily casualty rate never dropped below 1,200 soldiers. By some accounts, Russia's losses are likely to significantly speed up, owing to the fact that Putin is starting to receive external pressure from China and Iran, 2 of Russia's largest trading partners and weapons suppliers, whether indirectly or not. This implies that Russia is likely to become even more aggressive to try and close out the war before Ukraine can mount an overwhelming defense with NATO's help. That means that the likely death toll will skyrocket, especially considering reports the Russian army is severely undertrained and under-equipped for combat. But perhaps Russia has lost many more people outside of combat. We're talking about the great emigration out of Russia to avoid the draft and/or the country's oppressive regime. According to some estimates, as many as 300,000 people left the country within the first few months of the war. The immigration crisis became so bad in 2022 that some reports suggest as many as 1 million Russians left the country. Most of these immigrants are middle or upper middle class, white-collar workers who took their families with them. This means that the country has lost a significant number of people who worked in desirable industries such as tech and services. In fact, the war in Ukraine has been described as the worst crisis in the tech industry that the country has ever seen. Some analysts suggest that the death of the tech industry in Russia began even before the official special military operation in Ukraine. They say that this is the result of the country's attempts to heavily regulate the internet and the pushing out of prominent tech companies for failing to align themselves with the Kremlin's rhetoric. The issue became even larger after the invasion, when Russian tech companies were sanctioned by the West, practically cutting off businesses that had any connection to the EU or NATO from Russia. Finally, there's another factor that comes into play when it comes to uneven labor distribution: the structure of Russia's economy. For decades, Russia has been banking on its rich oil and gas reserves to propel its economy forward. This has created corporations in the energy industry that employ tens of thousands of people, However, the booming energy industry has created a positive feedback loop of people leaving the manufacturing and agricultural industries to join it. As Russia starts relying more and more on its energy exports, it's seen an increasing number of people join the energy industry and new companies popping up. These companies need a workforce to meet their demands and are in a position to use higher wages to attract employees. People who previously worked in manufacturing and industry leave their posts to join the new positions. But the energy industry actually employs relatively few people for its size, owing to significant automation and scaling capabilities. But there's another industry working alongside it to starve Russia of its manufacturing capacity: the service industry. As more people make more money from profitable investments in the energy industry, so they require new avenues to spend it. The service industry has begun catering more and more to the new energy oligarchs and the upper classes that have risen from the gains of exporting oil and gas products. As a result, the service industry is growing and thus requires more personnel. Since the energy industry, like the tech industry, already offers comparatively lucrative wages, people who work in industries that are not as well paid, such as the aforementioned manufacturing sector, then leave to become service workers. This imbalance in industry prominence has led Russia to overwhelmingly depend on the health of its energy industry. So long as the oil and gas flow through the pipelines and trade routes, the Russian economy can keep on growing. But the sudden lack of new workers available for the service industry, sanctions from the West that limit Russia's ability to trade, and a dwindling domestic capacity to manufacture products for Russia's own purposes are all working against that growth. Furthermore, Ukraine is doing its best to topple Russia's energy industry by launching long-range missile attacks on vital oil refineries in the west of the country. Since Russia relies on-demand refining and export, it doesn't actually have a large stockpile of products ready to go. Disabling a few key refineries is one of the key factors that has led to a countrywide shortage of diesel and gas, so much so that the Russian government enacted an export ban on those products to all countries that weren't previously part of the Soviet Union. If Ukraine keeps up the tempo, it could lead to Russia being unable to meet its own domestic demand, let alone continuing exporting products. In the same vein, China and India, two of the largest importers of Russian oil and gas, have significantly more leverage to demand lower prices than the EU had before the war. They can also look elsewhere for their import needs, such as the former Soviet countries, the Middle East, or even the US in the case of India. Furthermore, China is building its Belt and Road Initiative program, with one of the key first phases being a connection to Pakistan and the Middle East to secure more oil and gas. With all this in mind, the energy industry, which as we have seen already is causing significant manpower issues for other industries, is nowhere near as stable as the Russian government would like it to be. But just how large is the manpower problem for Russia? It turns out that the country's unemployment rate has plummeted to below 3%. You might think that a country having a low unemployment rate is good for its economy and growth. After all, if everyone has a job, that means the country gets more taxes and can boost local economies, right? Well, it turns out that there are a few different types of unemployment rates at work. The first is structural unemployment, which comes from industries or companies changing or evolving to need fewer workers, or from geographical factors reducing the demand for certain types of workers. An example of this is the tech industry in Russia. When companies move their headquarters out of Russia, fewer Russian workers are needed to fill whatever positions are left. The second type is frictional unemployment, meaning people who are in between jobs and looking for work. In general, in a healthy economy, the percentage of frictionally unemployed people should never be close to zero. While this might sound counterintuitive, having a decent number of people available to hire means that companies have talent pools to draw from when they create new job openings. The problem with a 3% unemployment rate is that this number is typically below what is considered to be a healthy structural to frictional unemployment ratio. Essentially, it implies that there are too few people circulating in the talent pool. This means that Russian companies are limited in the new talent they can attract in order to grow their businesses and thereby the economy, a practical necessity in a capitalist society. Furthermore, the impact of tech workers leaving the industry en masse has drained the potential of one of Russia's most promising industries. The low unemployment rate also risks directly increasing inflation in the country. The opening year of the war saw the inflation rate soar to around 12% annually. While the government managed to curb the inflation rate, it's potentially done so at the expense of the country's long-term economic prospects. With the inflation rate for 2023 at 7% and the current year-over-year inflation as of August 2024 at 9%, it would seem that those short-term measures are no longer enough. The increased inflation has the potential to lead to yet another type of unemployment, where jobs stop paying enough to match the inflation rate. And rising unemployment of this type will only speed up the decline of the country's economy. So the war in Ukraine, coupled with mass emigration of skilled workers, is slowly draining the country's economy by way of lowering the available workforce. But the demographics problem Russia is experiencing started way before Russia invaded Ukraine. It could be said that Russia's demographic downfall started back in the 90s when the Soviet Union fell. This is evident from the birth rates and total fertility rates, i.e. the number of births per woman. The desired fertility rate for all nations is 2.1 and above. This practically ensures that the birth rate is greater than natural deaths, which keeps the native population growing without the need for immigration. However, Russia's birth rate was last at 2.1 all the way back in 1988. At the turn of the 90s, the birth rate started declining sharply, reaching as low as 1.4 as soon as 1993. But it's here that the real trouble started. The birth rate fluctuated between 1.2 and 1.4 for the next 14 years, a primary factor in the forecasted loss of 15 million people. The dangerously low birth rates in the mid-90s and early 2000s means there's a huge swathe of a generation of young adults between the ages of 20 and 30 missing from Russia's current demographic distribution. These missing adults are obviously not breeding, causing yet another swathe of missing children today, which is accentuating the low birth rate in the country. But what was the exact cause of the low birth rate in Russia at the turn of the millennium? Somewhat unsurprisingly, it was the economy. Typically, economic growth caused in particular by women taking up positions previously only held by men can in turn cause a decline in fertility, much like what the West is experiencing right now. But Russia had the opposite problem. The first years after the fall of the Soviet Union saw the country undergo an economic and demographic upheaval. This had two results that closely correlated with the reduction in births. First, the lower wages and economic measures that made a portion of the population poorer meant that more people had less means to support having children. This was compounded by the fact that kindergartens and nurseries became much less available at the time, putting even more pressure on parents to devote their working time to supporting children. This means that families would typically be forced to support themselves on a single person's salary. Considering the disastrous state of Russia's economy at the time, this would have been an insurmountable burden for many. Secondly, the country experienced a drastic increase in the death rate for men aged 30 to 55. Since these men would have been the fathers or grandfathers of the children born at the time, women who lost their male family members would be forced to raise children by themselves. This fear of being a single mother is likely to have spread through the Russian population, which could account in part for the decline in the birth rate. Furthermore, the country has experienced a proliferation of access to contraception and abortion services. Easier abortion access is likely to have made the choice to terminate a pregnancy more compelling if a male partner was missing. This rationale is supported by Russia's extremely high abortion rate at the time. The number of abortions per 100,000 people numbered 2,100 in 2000, compared to just 500 in recent years. As the Russian economy bounced back, particularly after the global recession in 2008, so did the fertility rate, reaching a somewhat more manageable number of 1.8 for the better part of the 2010s. However, the damage had already been done. The lack of births, combined with a higher death rate of men in the late 90s, all contributed to the slow decline of the population of the Russian Federation over a few decades. If we go back to the total population figures, the actual population of Russia didn't change much in those 3 decades. This can be attributed to increased immigration, particularly from former Soviet countries in Central Asia. In particular, 1994 held the highest net migration rate at 877,000. However, net migration petered out over the following decades, reaching a low of around 40,000 more people entering the country than leaving it annually. And as we mentioned before, the emigration problem has worsened over the past 3 years during the war, with countless people leaving Russia and many of them having no plans to go back. This will likely force Russia to look elsewhere for sources of manpower like China, India, and other Asian countries. But even if Putin does manage to attract more working adults to the country, the solution might not be as easy a fix as it might first seem. You see, Russia is officially an Orthodox Christian country. However, vast swathes of the nation are populated by minorities of different faiths. The religious and cultural differences have already created some significant issues, such as income inequality between the minorities and the major population centers, or lopsided conscription demographics, suggesting the military is disproportionately targeting the former. So if Russia turns to using an imported labor force from countries that don't share the same culture, in effect, most countries outside of Europe, this could lead to even more widespread issues around cultural divides and racial tensions. The war in Ukraine is also directly contributing to this set of issues. One of the direct consequences of the war has been a massive displacement of civilians, both in Russia and Ukraine. According to some estimates, more than 5 million Ukrainians are displaced within Russia. Furthermore, the recent Ukrainian invasion of Kursk is estimated to have caused an additional 120,000 to 200,000 displaced civilians. These people are likely to create an additional economic and administrative burden for the state, and with the war in Ukraine still raging on, it's likely that a growing number of ethnic Ukrainians are feeling less favorably about the Russian government under whose authority they are living. So what actions has Russia taken to counter the widespread population issue? Perhaps one of the most notable changes is the country's more conservative approach to abortion access and reproduction rights. As mentioned, the abortion rate was at its highest in the mid-90s, dropping by 75% in the subsequent 30 years. This is no coincidence. 2003 saw the government impose much stricter conditions on the circumstances under which women can seek an abortion, limiting them to cases of rape, the father dying or becoming disabled during pregnancy, or cases where the mother's parental rights were restricted, such as by being in prison. The 2010s saw abortion requirements practically skyrocket. Although at first the legalities around seeking an abortion didn't change, the lawmakers created more barriers to obtaining one. For example, physicians were tasked with showing the woman the fetal heartbeat, presumably in an attempt to dissuade them from undertaking the procedure. The consent forms were also changed to be much more critical of the choice for abortion and to emphasize the potential risks that the procedure could have. In more recent years, Russian Health Minister Mikhail Murashko even went so far as to publicly criticize women who chose education or work over childbearing and proposed a ban on private abortion clinics, which handle roughly 20% of all abortions performed in the country. The government also tried to directly emphasize the need for more children and families in the modern age. Just a few months after the war began, Putin brought back the Soviet-era award of Mother Heroine. The award is presented to women who have given birth to or raised 10 or more Russian citizens and comes with a prize of 1 million rubles, around $10,330 at the time of writing. Putin has also repeatedly emphasized the importance of women in Russian society, but as mothers and caregivers to children rather than working adults. In one of the more humorous stories, Putin's health minister, Yevgeny Shestopolov, was reported to have urged citizens to have sex during work breaks to bolster the population. Some politicians have added to the sex during work comment, proposing that businesses should monitor their employees and the size of the families they roster. Russian feminists, as one might expect, have criticized these efforts, commenting that the measures are a clear remark on how women are being used to foster a new generation of soldiers and taxpayers. The government has also included financial incentives for students under the age of 24 who give birth to their first child, with a payment of $9,000. Other incentives include a stipend or one-off payments for mothers who give birth to triplets or people in the Far East who adopt orphans, but these can vary wildly between regions, and most local governments appear to stick to the minimum wherever possible. In 2020, Putin signed a new law aimed at expanding Russia's population by relaxing requirements for foreigners seeking Russian citizenship. Officials estimated this law could add up to 10 million new citizens over the coming decades. Later that year, a separate proposal targeted Russian officials specifically, prohibiting them from holding dual citizenship if they lived outside Russia, a law that passed in January 2021. Soon after, another amendment allowed Russian citizens with dual citizenship easier entry into military service. Confused yet? Well, the changes didn't stop there. In late 2023, the law was completely overhauled, making it significantly easier to obtain Russian citizenship for people who uphold traditional Russian spiritual and moral values, even if they don't speak Russian. The sudden change, especially considering that it came at the time when Russia was deep in its efforts to conquer Ukraine, could be seen as further evidence that Russia is starting to run out of people who can work or fight for the country. But there's yet another aspect to why the current war in Ukraine is important when discussing current Russian demographics, especially with respect to its economy. As a result of the Western sanctions, Russia was in effect forced to abandon the EU and most Western countries as potential trading partners, instead turning to China, India, and the rest of the so-called Global South. But Russia's alliance with China hinges on it being able to supply the Chinese industry with much-needed natural resources such as minerals, timber, and even fresh drinking water. All these can be found in abundance in Siberia and the Russian Far East. But those regions of Russia are sparsely populated. Practically all of Siberia and the Far East, except for a small part of Outer Manchuria, have a population density of less than 5 people per square kilometer, with most of the territory having fewer than 2 people per square kilometer. Compare this to China's population density, which averages 150 people per square kilometer. The sentiment here is clear: Russia has a significantly underdeveloped Far East, but that's precisely the part of the country that China is interested in. For China to have access to these resources, it's invested over $2.4 billion in Russia to develop the infrastructure needed for export. However, the infrastructure itself isn't enough to secure the flow of resources. The workforce to use and power it is also required. Furthermore, some of China's efforts to secure Russian drinking water from Lake Baikal, the world's largest freshwater lake by volume, haven't been successful. And this is where the war in Ukraine comes into play. So long as Russia is embroiled in a war, chances are its economy and industry are going to be significantly slanted towards supporting the war effort rather than creating new opportunities to export resources to China. After all, the 2024 budget report stated that roughly a third of all government spending for the year was allocated to the military and national defense. This is a significantly larger part of the budget than most other developed countries allocate to their militaries. Additionally, it can be argued that obtaining a larger workforce was one of the key reasons why Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place. Ukraine's population in 2022 was around 40 million, less than a third of Russia's. However, the country itself is much smaller, resulting in a much higher population density. Ukrainians are also ethnically and culturally close to Russians, and a substantial ethnic Ukrainian population has been living in the current Russian Federation since Soviet times, with some claiming, perhaps correctly, that Russia's ultimate goal of its special military operation in Ukraine was to restore the full extent of its Soviet-era territory. It's possible that absorbing the Ukrainian population is one of the secondary objectives of the invasion. But with making headway into Ukrainian territory proving a slow, deadly, and extremely costly affair, Russia's military and demographic problems are starting to stack up. For the past 2.5 years, China has been practically silent about the war. However, Western institutions have slowly applied more pressure on Chinese companies and banks to stop working with Russia, which have started to bear fruit. China has proposed a peace plan, considered outrageous by the West but seemingly supported by much of the global South. Under this plan, Russia would get to keep all the territory it's annexed so far, an outcome which the Ukrainian regime is likely to continue rejecting outright. This suggests that China's alliance with Russia might be fully dependent on Russia's ability to be an exporter of resources, something that it can't guarantee if it's still at war, and thus China wants Russia to end the war quickly. On the other hand, if Russia ends the war without securing a claim on some or all of Ukraine, the bulk of its long-term demographic problems will remain nowhere close to being solved. In fact, considering that the country's economy would seem to be closer to collapsing as a result of the government funneling more money into the military than into healthcare or education, it's possible that the earlier forecasts of Russia losing 15 million people in 20 years could become a best-case scenario. And if the war in Ukraine continues and Russian casualties keep piling up, the military's war machine will start asking for more people to throw into the meat grinder in Donbass. That will only serve to make the problem worse. But what do you think? How will Russia try to get out of the demographic hole it's dug itself into? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.